50 Comanche warriors appeared on the hill at dawn, silent as death's own judgment. For Malachi Brooks, a man who had fled the world for 8 years, they hadn't just come to collect a blood debt. They had come to burn his small world to ash. 12 hours earlier, he was just a solitary man in a desolate land. But a single decision, one act of mercy for a dying native girl by the creek, had unintentionally signed his own death warrant. He had saved a life, but now he had to face an army that had come to take his. The dawn stained the horizon red, and on the hilltop, a line of warriors appeared like phantoms. Nearly 50 horsemen, their faces were death masks painted for battle, watching silently in the early light. Yet, just one evening prior, Malachi Brooks could not have imagined that a single act of kindness could push his entire small world to the brink of destruction. The previous afternoon, as Malachi was herding his cattle near the creek, a sound cut through the silence. A faint whimper, almost swallowed by the sounds of running water and the wind. For a man who had chosen a life of isolation for 8 years, any human sound was unusual, but this was more. It was the desperate call of a dying soul. He found her huddled behind a thorny bush. A dark stain was spreading on the dry ground beneath her small frame. A native girl, perhaps only 16, with a hole in her shoulder and a fever that was burning her body from within. Her breath was shallow and ragged. Survival instinct screamed in Malachi's head, urging him to turn away. It was the wise choice, the safe choice. In this land, helping a Comanche was no different from signing one's own death warrant. But something about the girl held him back. Perhaps it was because she was so young, or the way her hand gripped a simply carved wooden item. It evoked the image of his daughter, who used to clutch her cloth doll whenever she was scared. Sarah. She would have been this age if she had lived. Malachi knelt beside the girl, checking the wound. The bullet had passed through, but the poison of infection was already spreading fast. She needed immediate medical attention, or she wouldn't last the night. He looked out at the desolate landscape, knowing that for dozens of miles, he was likely the only person who could save her. In that moment, he made a choice that would change everything. He gently lifted her, feeling her body surprisingly light, fragile. Her eyelids fluttered, her dark, panicked eyes meeting his for a moment, a look that recalled the final moment of his own daughter. Then she sank back into unconsciousness, her body limp in his arms. Malachi carried the girl toward his wooden cabin, knowing he was inviting the most dangerous kind of trouble right to his doorstep. But as he laid her on his bed and began to clean the wound, he felt no regret. The long night passed in a haze of stitches, whiskey-soaked rags, and cool water. When the first streaks of the new day crept through the cracks in the door, the girl's fever had finally broken. She would live. But when Malachi stepped outside, into the cool morning air, a different kind of chill ran down his spine. They were there. A long, silent line on the hill, their silhouettes etched against the rising sun. Even from this distance, the glint of metal and the dark slashes of paint on their skin spoke a language of menace. The instant he stepped back inside, the girl's eyes flew open. Terror immediately erased all traces of weakness. She tried to bolt from the bed like a cornered animal, but her wounded shoulder betrayed her, sending her collapsing back onto the bed with a stifled scream of pain. "Stay still," Malachi said, his voice low, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. "You're safe here." But her eyes told him she knew better. A native girl in a white man's cabin, with warriors encircling it, was the definition of danger. Words tumbled from her mouth in her own tongue, a frantic cascade of sounds as her uninjured arm pointed toward the door. Amidst that torrent of words, Malachi caught a single one he recognized: "Father." He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutter. The horsemen had stopped a few hundred yards out, forming a silent, unmoving wall of judgment. They weren't attacking, but they weren't leaving either. At the center of the formation was a man larger and more imposing than the rest. The leader. Her father. "They think I've taken you," Malachi murmured, the grim reality of the situation crashing down on him. He helped her sit up, propping her against the headboard. She possessed a wild, untamed beauty, and her intelligent eyes seemed to pierce right through him. But now, fear was a mask on that beauty. She pointed to her chest. "Ayanna," she said, her voice hoarse. Then her gaze shifted to him, an unspoken question. "Malachi," he replied. The name felt foreign on his tongue after months of silence. Suddenly, a voice boomed across the open space, deep and powerful, carrying an authority that could not be denied. It spoke in the harsh syllables of the Comanche language. The color drained from Ayanna's face. "What's he saying?" Malachi pressed. Ayanna looked at him, and for a moment, he saw something like pity in her eyes. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "He says, you have 1 hour. Hand over my daughter, or they will burn everything." Malachi's chest felt as if squeezed by an invisible hand. 60 minutes. Only 60 minutes to resolve a hopeless situation. To explain himself to warriors who saw only hatred in their eyes, in a language he did not speak. But as he looked into Ayanna's horrified eyes, he knew the problem wasn't a language barrier. A more terrible truth was hidden beneath the surface, and it was about to explode. Her hand suddenly shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her thin fingers dug into his flesh with the surprising strength of desperation. Not my father," she whispered, her voice breaking with fear. Malachi froze. "What do you mean?" Ayanna didn't answer with words. Instead, she brought her good hand to her wounded shoulder, then made a sharp, definitive gesture. The gesture of someone pulling the trigger. "He did this." Malachi's world seemed to tilt. Every misplaced piece suddenly fell into its horrifying place. "Why?" he asked, though he wasn't sure she would understand. Tears welled in her eyes, but Ayanna's voice was frighteningly steady. I saw him kill a white family." She sobbed, the horrific memory returning. "Women, children. He told me to tell no one, but Her hand touched the pendant at her neck. I could not stay silent. A wave of nausea churned in Malachi's stomach. This wasn't a rescue mission. This was an execution. Takakota had hunted his own daughter to silence a witness. The 50 warriors outside were not a search party. They were an unwitting firing squad, deceived by the very leader they trusted. The voice outside boomed again, closer this time, more impatient. "What is he saying now?" Malachi asked. Ayanna's face grew even paler. "He's telling them that you were the one who shot me, that you took me ... to defile me." Of course they believed it. Takakota was their chief. His word was law, was truth. Malachi realized with a cold dread that he wasn't just harboring a wounded girl. He was harboring the only witness to a war crime. And the perpetrator was standing right outside his door, with an army at his back. "There's more," Ayanna whispered, her voice barely audible. "The family he killed, they were not the only ones." Malachi's heart hammered against his ribs like a war drum. She tried to explain in English, then gave up, switching to a fast, desperate torrent of Comanche, her hand gesturing wildly. He didn't need a translator. The absolute terror in her eyes said it all. This wasn't just one massacre. It was a series of them. The voice outside grew angry, demanding. The sound of weapons being readied filled the air. That's when Ayanna spoke. The final words, the words that drove the last nail into their coffin. "He knows you heard me talk. He knows, you know." Malachi's mouth went dry. The circle had closed. Takakota was no longer here just to silence his daughter. He was here to erase all traces. The sound of hooves circling the cabin was like a death drum, each beat a second ticking away from their short remaining lives. Ayana staggered to her feet, holding onto the bedpost to stay upright. "I will go out," she said, her voice weak but resolute. "I will tell them the truth. Better that I die alone." Malachi shook his head immediately, his voice firm. "It's useless. The moment you step out, you will die, and then it will be my turn." He looked straight into her eyes, the naked, cruel truth hanging between them. "Takakota has gone too far. He cannot let any witness live. We both know too much." That truth landed like a death sentence. But then, another voice called from outside. Younger, speaking in hesitant, broken English. "That is Koshi," Ayana whispered, a flicker of light in her desperate eyes. "My cousin. He is a good man. He does not know ... An idea ignited in Malachi's mind, a crazy, almost suicidal plan. But it was the only chance they had. If they couldn't convince an army, perhaps they could convince one man. He moved to the gun rack, taking down his rifle and checking the chamber. "What are you doing?" Ayana asked, fear returning to her eyes. "Something stupid," he replied. But then he paused. His gaze was fixed on the pendant around her neck. He stepped closer, his voice low. "It's not Comanche, is it?" Ayana's face went white. "How did you know?" "Because that's why he made you take it," Malachi explained, the bitter truth becoming crystal clear. "To frame you. To make you an accomplice in the eyes of others. That is the proof." War cries began to sound from outside. A unified, angry roar. Time was up. "We're not going out to talk," Malachi said, his voice firm. He moved to the back wall of the cabin, pushed aside a loose panel, revealing a dark opening. "This is the way out. A tunnel I dug during the Apache raids. It leads to the ravine behind the ridge. My horses are down there." A loud crack came from the front door as the wood began to splinter under the force of a heavy blow. "Go now," Malachi urged, pushing Ayana toward the narrow entrance. "I'm right behind you." Ayana plunged into the narrow darkness of the tunnel, every movement a hot knife stabbing into her shoulder. Behind her, the sound of the front door shattering and angry Comanche shouts filled the cabin. They crawled through the suffocating space, dirt crumbling around them. Suddenly, she froze, her blood turning to ice. Takakota's voice. Not from the cabin, but from behind them, in the tunnel itself. The entrance had been found. "Malachi," she whispered in panic, but when she looked back, only thick darkness answered. He was gone. She burst out of the tunnel, gasping for air, the pain in her shoulder like a raging fire. Just as Malachi had said, there was a small clearing, sheltered by rocks and brush, with 2 saddled horses waiting. But where was Malachi? She turned back to the dark mouth of the tunnel, listening. Only a dead silence. Then, multiple gunshots echoed from the direction of the cabin. Her heart sank. "Run!" her mind screamed. But she couldn't leave the man who had saved her life. Just then, a figure staggered out of the darkness, covered in dirt and blood. "I told you to go on ahead," Malachi said through gritted teeth, one hand clutching his side where his shirt was torn and stained a dark red. "I collapsed part of the tunnel. Bought us a few minutes." He helped her onto her horse, then quickly mounted the other. They galloped through the ravine, trying to keep low behind the rock walls. But the sound of hooves and the war cries of their pursuers were already echoing from the canyon walls behind them. "They're coming," Ayana yelled over. "The rushing wind, I know," Malachi answered, pointing ahead where the ravine opened onto a vast plain. "Once we're out there, we'll be completely exposed. It will be a pure race." They shot out of the ravine like an arrow, the morning sun blazing on the endless grassland. Behind them, the first Comanche riders appeared, quickly spreading out into an arc formation to cut off any escape. The race for their lives had truly begun. Strength was draining from Ayana. The pain and blood loss made her vision blur. She began to sway in the saddle, darkness creeping in at the edges. Just then, she saw it. A dust cloud on the horizon, moving quickly toward them. Her heart stopped. More warriors? The flicker of hope was extinguished. But then Malachi yelled, a shout not of fear, but of sheer, unadulterated joy. Blue uniforms. Look, Ayanna, it's a cavalry patrol. Hope was right ahead, but death was still hot on their heels. The cavalry patrol, about a dozen men, quickly formed a defensive line, the barrels of their rifles rising as one. Don't shoot! Malachi yelled as they drew near, his voice hoarse. From the dust, we're not looking for a fight. We need protection. He held the fading Ayanna tightly in her saddle. This girl. She has information about the murder of the Henderson family. The name Henderson was like a switch. The stony expression of the commanding Captain Morrison changed instantly. Medic. He shouted to a soldier, then spurred his horse closer. The Hendersons were friends of mine. What do you know about their deaths? Ayanna struggled to lift her head, her voice weak but clear and filled with indignation. Chief Takakota. He killed them, and others, I saw it. The captain narrowed his eyes. That is a very serious accusation, miss. She has proof, Malachi said, pointing to the pendant still stained with dried blood around Ayanna's neck. Morrison leaned down to examine the wooden carving. His weathered face darkened in an instant. This is Emily Henderson's. The girl showed it to me when they stopped at the fort. At that moment, Koshi rode forward alone from the Comanche ranks, his hands raised in a sign of peace. Captain, sir, he said carefully, my chief says this white man kidnapped his daughter and harmed her. Morrison looked at Ayanna, waiting for an answer. No. Ayanna's voice was suddenly strong, fueled by indignation. He saved my life. It was Takakota who shot me when I tried to flee to tell the truth. Koshi was stunned. Ayanna let loose a torrent of Comanche, her voice both pained and steely, each word a hammer blow against her cousin's loyalty. Malachi watched Koshi's face transform. Through a spectrum of emotions, from confusion to horror, and finally to unconcealable rage. Without another word, Koshi wheeled his horse around, galloped back, and confronted the warriors. They could see him speaking urgently, pointing toward Takakota. A rift of argument and confusion began to form in their ranks. Realizing he had lost control, Takakota let out a savage roar. He suddenly broke from the formation, spurring his horse straight forward like a storm. But his target was not the soldiers. It was Ayanna. A single sharp and decisive shot rang out. Morrison's rifle had spoken. Takakota tumbled from his horse, rolling several times in the dusty earth and lying still. The captain was over him before he could stir, the barrel of his rifle aimed at his face. Chief Takakota, Morrison said, his voice like ice. You are under arrest for the murder of the Henderson family and for conspiracy to incite warfare through false testimony. Takakota spat blood and cursed it in Comanche. Ayanna translated, her voice trembling. He says you have no proof. Morrison gave a grim smile. Tell him we will soon enough. We will find the scalps he's been hiding. And when we do, his own people will know what kind of monster they've been following. 3 weeks later, Ayanna stood steady at the hearing at Fort Davidson. The wound on her shoulder had begun to scar, but the wound in the heart of the tribes would fester for much longer. Her testimony was steely and unshakable. The undeniable proof, the 6 scalps hidden away like trophies, had been found exactly where she had indicated. Faced with the hideous truth about the leader they had revered, the last warriors loyal to Takakota had quietly turned their backs on him. Justice, though late and bloody, was finally served, but that victory came at a high price. The scar of deception that Takakota left was deep. The fragile trust between the tribes and the army, already thin as a spider's thread, had been shattered. It would take many years, perhaps even generations, to mend, And as for Malachi, he was never seen again at his isolated cabin. That place had become part of a past he had finally put to rest. Some said he went east, seeking a new start in more peaceful lands. Others swore they had seen a quiet man with sad eyes helping travelers in need on the harsh frontier trails. Only Ayanna knew the truth for sure. The act of saving her life didn't just change her fate, it also saved his own soul. The man running from the memory of his lost daughter had finally found peace, not by forgetting, but by protecting another life. He was no longer running, because she understood that some acts of compassion, performed in a moment of life and death, don't just save a life. They have the power to reshape an entire existence, not that of the one who receives, but of the one who is brave enough to give.